Thank you. For the record, I'm Ken Kramer. I'm the Water Resources Chairman for the Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the opportunity to visit with you today. I'm going to focus on that requirement that was in the House Bill 4 enabling legislation of 2013 that says, in effect, that Water Development Board shall undertake to apply not less than 20% of the SWIFT funding over a 5-year period for conservation or reuse. And specifically, and this is something that I have to admit I didn't remember until I looked back at the legislation from 2013, but the 5-year period that it talks about is actually between the adoption of one state water plan and the next plan. So I'm not quite sure what period of time Water Development Board has to actually demonstrate that not less than 20% for this first initial set of SWIFT funding or funded projects, but could be anywhere until 2020 or 2021, depending upon how you look at it. I think that's important to keep in mind, though, because basically we're only in the second year of SWIFT funding. And so we don't have a full track record yet about the extent to which SWIFT funds will help to fund conservation or reuse projects. We did see from 2015 to 2016 an increase in the number of applications for conservation or reuse projects from the SWIFT fund. So that's a positive thing. I believe this year, of the 28 applicants that Water Development Board invited to submit a full application for SWIFT, roughly a third of those projects were either conservation or reuse projects. So that's a very positive development for SWIFT. But I think we have to basically say that at this point, our assessment of the use of SWIFT for conservation or reuse projects is somewhat preliminary because we just don't have that much of a track record yet. There are some both positive and potentially problematic things, though, that I might want to point out for your benefit in looking at SWIFT as a funding mechanism for conservation or reuse. I think I fully agree with Chairman Brune in his comments this morning that probably over a 5-year period, you will find that that 20% target will be met, maybe even exceeded, especially through reuse projects, which are often fairly costly, and certainly the track record in terms of the applications this year indicate that 20% may be relatively easy to reach just in terms of reuse projects, although conservation may be a little more problematic if you're talking about activities other than reuse. Although water loss control, for example, replacing leaky pipes, water mains, and things of that nature, which would be eligible for SWIFT funding, certainly could add up to a fairly large amount of money that would meet the 20% also. But let me point out a couple of not necessarily impediments, but some problematic things with use of SWIFT funding or actually any debt financing for water conservation. One of the things you often hear from utilities when you explore with them whether or not they might want to consider going to the Water Development Board for a water conservation project to be funded by SWIFT is a concern about how they pay off the debt that's incurred when they're basically borrowing money from the Water Development Board. You know, normally water utility would go to the Water Development Board seeking funding for a new infrastructure project that's going to create more water that they then potentially can sell and generate revenue and pay back the debt out of that revenue. But if you go to the Water Development Board seeking funding for conservation, which has the potential to reduce water use and potentially then reduce your revenue from water sales, it's a little more problematic in terms of how you actually going to pay back that debt that's incurred. Now, there are ways of doing it, but it's not something that's part of the normal model for how utilities operate. A second issue that has arisen, which may have been brought to your attention before, is this issue of whether or not debt financing is complicated for water conservation because of some generally acceptable accounting principles that tend to interfere with the process. Now, this is not something that is problematic with regard to things like water loss control activities or something that's entirely within a water utility's control. But here's the issue. There's a body that's called the Government Accounting Standards Board, which, despite its name, is not a government agency. It's actually a private organization that was created, I think, over 30 years ago, that basically has come to be recognized by state, local government agencies as a body that basically sets out generally acceptable accounting standards by which utilities and others are evaluated. And one of the things that they consider to be a generally accepted accounting principle is that in terms of debt financing, that a utility must maintain control of the asset if they use debt to finance a particular activity. So, for example, if a utility replaces leaky water lines in its distribution system, well, that's an asset that's entirely within the control of the utility, those water lines. But if a utility were to, for example, try through debt financing to finance a toilet retrofit program for their customers, those toilets are not, if you will, an asset controlled by the utility. They become the property of the customer. And so for the Government Accounting Standards Board, that's not considered to be something within the control of the utility, and therefore they think that's problematic. Now, I need to emphasize this is not a legal matter per se. It's not a matter of law. It's not really a matter of public policy. It's simply an accounting definition. But because many state and local governments take that set of standards from the Government Accounting Standards Board as sort of gospel, that makes it a little problematic for them to be taking on debt to finance a water conservation activity. Now, there are ways of dealing with that, but it just sort of sets a little bit of an obstacle at the outset for a utility to consider debt financing for a water conservation project of some type. So I guess the bottom line is that many utilities don't see getting debt financing for water conservation to be part of their normal way of doing business, and that creates a little bit of a problem. Now, even when debt financing is the best choice, I do want to point out that SWIFT may not be the ideal mechanism for getting that money. Water Development Board has many other funding programs, like the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, where you can get money for water loss control, and that may actually be better in terms of some of the particular aspects of that program. But the Water Development Board can basically identify for the applicant what the best program is. I do want to emphasize, though, that I think that the Water Development Board is totally committed to not only meeting or really exceeding that 20% target. And many of us are working hard to help them do that. Sierra Club, for example, in January of this year, had a workshop in Houston attended by about 75 people, including water utility professionals, for the specific purpose of promoting use of SWIFT for water conservation projects. We're going to have another workshop of that type in Grapevine later this month. It's going to be co-sponsored by Sierra Club, by Tarrant Regional Water District, North Texas Municipal Water District, and Dallas Water Utilities. So we're working to try to promote SWIFT for conservation. We're also exploring the possibility of doing a specific guidance manual to show people how they can use SWIFT for conservation. And I want to say that we are getting support and participation from Water Development Board, Carlos Rubenstein, the former chair of the board, and many water utility professionals. But a couple things in conclusion. I think we shouldn't put all of our conservation eggs in the SWIFT basket, if you will. There are many ways to achieve conservation. SWIFT is one of them. Another is PACE, which Chairman Keffer knows about, the Property Assessed Clean Energy program, which allows a new financing option for water efficiency and energy efficiency. And I'm very happy to say that a number of entities around the state are now adopting PACE programs, most recently City of Dallas, for example. So we're seeing some, I think, progress in that regard as well. We do think there's still a need to fund a widespread water education program in Texas through the Water Development Board to help especially small and medium-sized utilities in terms of being able to educate their consumers about conservation. There's also, I think, the possibility for a competitive grants program from the state to help small and medium-sized utilities undertake conservation programs. In conclusion, let me say that I think it's going to take all these things to achieve the potential that we can have in Texas for water conservation. We recently released a Texas Water Conservation Scorecard that I think demonstrates there's a lot more that utilities can do in Texas to advance conservation, but it's going to take a variety of support for them to be able to do that, and SWIFT is an important but not the only means of that support. Thank you.